You can tell a lot about a person by where they think empty space begins. The first tire mark appeared on a Thursday morning at exactly 6:18. I remember because my sprinkler controller clicked at 6:15 every day, and I was standing in the kitchen waiting for coffee when I looked out the front window and noticed something wrong with the lawn. Nothing dramatic. Just a dark curve pressed into the grass near the curb. 2 tracks. Clean edges. Fresh. I stared at them for a second, trying to understand what looked different. Then my brain caught up. Somebody had parked on the edge of my yard. Not fully. Just enough. 1 tire over the curb. Maybe 18 inches onto the grass. I walked outside holding coffee and stood there in socks looking at compressed blades and damp soil. It had rained lightly overnight, so the impression stayed visible. I shrugged and figured somebody misjudged while turning around. End of story. That is what I thought. By Friday morning, there were new tracks. Same place. Same angle. Slightly deeper. Saturday morning again. Tire marks crossing the exact corner of the lawn where the irrigation lines branched under the surface. Now that bothered me. Not because of the grass. Because I installed that irrigation system myself 3 years earlier. Zone pressure. Smart scheduling. Moisture balancing. Most people think grass is decorative. Grass is infrastructure pretending to be landscaping. I walked the property line and looked toward the street. Then I noticed something interesting. Across from my house lived Linda Harper. White SUV. Always parked slightly diagonal. Always arriving late afternoon. Always leaving early. That day I happened to be outside trimming shrubs when she pulled in. Instead of using her driveway, she turned wide and rolled one side of the vehicle directly onto the corner of my lawn before stopping. Not far. Not aggressive. Just casual. Like land softened at the edges. She stepped out carrying shopping bags and saw me standing there. I smiled and said, "Hey, just letting you know your tire is crossing into my yard." She looked down, laughed lightly, and said, "Oh wow, I barely touched it." Then she climbed back in, reversed maybe 12 inches, smiled again, and walked inside. Friendly. Easy. End of story. Except Sunday morning there were fresh tracks again. Monday too. By Tuesday I realized something uncomfortable. She was not parking badly. She was parking consistently. Same angle. Same wheel position. Same lawn corner. Like she had unconsciously decided my grass counted as overflow space. I started noticing details. She never parked there if other people were outside. She only did it when arriving quickly or carrying things. Never enough to feel outrageous. Always enough to leave marks. I measured because my father believed measurements remove arguments. Average tire entry, 21 inches. Repeated compression area, roughly 6 feet long. Grass color changing slightly from compaction. Not damage yet. Pattern. That evening I repaired sprinkler heads in the backyard and kept thinking about something my father used to say while mowing. People rarely take land all at once. They borrow inches until nobody notices. Wednesday morning I woke up early and sat with coffee by the front window. At 7:11 her SUV arrived. Same movement. Wide turn. Front tire climbed the curb. Rolled into my lawn. Stopped. She got out and disappeared inside carrying grocery bags. I stood there watching the tire resting comfortably in grass that was still wet from overnight irrigation. Something about that annoyed me more than if she had parked completely on the lawn. Because partial things are harder to confront. You sound dramatic explaining them. It is only a little. Only a minute. Only a tire. I walked outside and waited. 20 minutes later she came back out. She smiled and waved. I pointed politely and said, "Hey, could you keep off the lawn completely? I just worked on the irrigation system." She looked genuinely surprised and said this little part. I said, "Yeah." She nodded and moved the car. Then she laughed and said, "I figured nobody uses the edge anyway." That sentence stayed with me the rest of the day. Nobody uses the edge anyway. That evening I stood beside the sprinkler control box listening to the quiet click of scheduled watering and looked at the corner of grass with the tire marks drying in afternoon sun. People always think boundaries are obvious. Most of the time they disappear because somebody decided they were decorative. The problem with small violations is that they make you question whether you are being unreasonable before you realize you are being trained. The week after I asked Linda to stay off the lawn, I expected the problem to disappear. Most normal neighbor issues do. You mention something once, everybody smiles awkwardly, and society continues. Monday morning came. No tire marks. Tuesday too. I actually felt a little guilty for being annoyed in the first place. Then Wednesday happened. I was watering flower beds in the backyard when I heard tires rolling slowly outside. Not the sound itself. The rhythm. Tires sound different on concrete than grass. Softer. Slightly compressed. I walked around the side of the house, and there it was. White SUV. Same angle. Same wheel. Same corner of lawn. She had not stopped fully this time. Just enough to unload 2 grocery bags. By the time I reached the front yard, she was already stepping back into the vehicle. She smiled and said, "I was only here for 1 minute." 1 minute. Interesting defense because nobody accused her of time. I smiled and said I thought we agreed to keep off the lawn. She laughed lightly and said she technically never parked. Then she drove away. That sentence stayed in my head the rest of the day. Technically never parked. I walked out and looked at the grass. You could already see it. Slight flattening. Slight discoloration. One sprinkler head tilted half an inch from pressure. Nothing serious. Yet, my father always said damage becomes expensive exactly 1 week after people stop taking it seriously. Thursday, I checked the irrigation zones manually. Pressure normal. Coverage normal. Soil slightly compacted at the corner. Again, Friday morning fresh tracks appeared. This time dry weather made them lighter, but visible if you knew where to look. That was the strange part. Once you notice a pattern, you cannot unsee it. I started observing naturally. Arrival times. Duration. Angles. She never crossed fully. Never enough to create a scene. Just enough to preserve plausible innocence. Friday. Evening she pulled up while I was mowing. Same move. Same corner. I shut the mower off and walked over. I asked if something made the driveway difficult to use. She looked confused and said no. I asked why she kept using the lawn edge. She shrugged and said honestly she thought it was easier for unloading because the curb was lower there. Then she added something that changed everything. You are not really using that part anyway. I looked at the corner of the yard and suddenly realized she actually believed that. She was not being rude. She had mentally reclassified my property as convenient space. That made the problem harder and simpler at the same time. I told her the irrigation system ran underneath that section. She nodded sympathetically and said okay, but 1 tire cannot hurt grass that much. Then she smiled and walked inside carrying shopping bags. That night, I sat on the porch after sunset listening to the sprinkler cycle start. Click. Valve open. Water pressure rise. Zone 1. The front corner activated first. Clean fan pattern. Precise coverage. The mist caught porch light and turned silver for a second. My father taught me irrigation systems when I was 16. He used to say water tells the truth because it follows paths people create. I stood there watching the spray hit the compacted patch and noticed something interesting. The grass absorbed differently there now. Not damaged. Just changed. Saturday morning, I measured soil density out of curiosity. Slight difference. Again. Then I opened the irrigation controller app and looked at schedules. Timers. Zones. Moisture adjustments. Seasonal settings. Everything exactly where I left it months ago. Completely normal. That was the moment an idea quietly entered the room. Not revenge. Not a trick. Just a realization. The system already had rules. Water already had timing. Grass already had boundaries. I closed the app and smiled to myself because for the first time since the tire mark started, I stopped thinking about convincing somebody and started thinking about letting routines speak for themselves. Once I stopped trying to convince her, the whole thing became easier to see. Patterns are relaxing. When you stop expecting people to change because you asked nicely. The next week, I did not mention the lawn once. No reminders. No signs. No awkward driveway conversations. I just watched. Monday, she stayed off the grass completely. Tuesday, too. I almost laughed at myself for overthinking everything. Then Wednesday at 5:42 p.m., the white SUV appeared again. Wide turn. Front tire over curb. Same corner. 30 seconds stopped. Reverse. Gone. Thursday, 1 minute 20 seconds. Friday, 58 seconds. Saturday morning, 3 separate entries because apparently unloading decorative storage bins required temporary ownership of my property. I started writing times in a notebook mostly because I was curious. Arrival time. Duration. Weather. Tire position. My father wrote everything down. He claimed memory becomes emotional, but paper stays boring. By Sunday evening, I had something interesting. She almost always arrived during a very specific window. Late afternoon, usually between 5:30 and 6:15. And every single time she parked on the lawn, My irrigation cycle for the front zone was still scheduled for early morning, meaning the corner stayed dry all afternoon. Convenient. I stood in the garage staring at the irrigation controller mounted beside the water heater and suddenly realized something funny. I had spent 2 weeks treating this like a neighbor issue when technically it was a scheduling issue. The lawn already had a routine. The tire already had a routine. Those routines simply never met. Monday evening I sat on the driveway cleaning sprinkler nozzles while Linda pulled in. Same move. Tire onto grass. She stepped out carrying shopping bags and smiled. I smiled back and said nothing. She paused like she expected a comment. None came. That seemed to confuse her more than complaints ever did. Tuesday, I tested irrigation manually. Zone 1. Front corner coverage. 15 feet radius. Full rotation. No overspray on a sidewalk. Perfect alignment. The water pattern looked almost elegant in evening light. Fine mist. Quiet rhythm. The controller allowed seasonal adjustment and custom activation windows. Useful feature. Wednesday morning, I checked weather forecasts. And soil moisture. No rain expected. Good drainage. Normal conditions. That afternoon, I noticed Linda arriving with a trunk full of shopping bags again. She turned wide. Tire onto grass. 37 seconds. Then gone. I watched from inside and realized she was comfortable now. The tire placement had become automatic. Not rebellion. Habit. That mattered. People defend decisions. Habits happen by themselves. Thursday evening I sat on the porch with iced tea and opened the irrigation app. Every setting already existed. No special programming. No unusual pressure. No changes outside normal operation. I adjusted one thing. Seasonal timing. Front lawn hydration moved from early morning to early evening because temperatures had increased that week and evaporation rates were higher. Perfectly reasonable. I looked at the schedule and smiled because the funniest part was realizing I had ignored that optimization for months. Friday came. Warm day. Dry air. Around 5:50, I watered flower beds manually in the backyard while the controller waited quietly. At 6:02, I heard tires. Slow roll. Familiar compression sound. I peeked through the side gate. White SUV. Same angle. Same wheel. Same confidence. She stepped out carrying paper bags and disappeared inside. I looked at the sprinkler timer mounted in the garage. 6 minutes until scheduled cycle. I closed the garage door and went inside. Not hiding. Just making dinner. My father always said systems feel magical to people who never notice schedules. At 6:08, I heard the soft click from the irrigation controller. Zone 1 active. Water pressure rising. Pipes filling. I looked out the window and saw the first sprinkler head slowly rotate upward from the corner of the lawn exactly where it always had. Smooth. Mechanical. Ordinary. The water had no opinion. It was simply on time. The thing nobody tells you about consequences is that they become funny only after you realize nobody actually caused them. At 6:08, the sprinkler system turned on exactly the way it had hundreds of times before. Soft click. Pressure rise. First head rotated up from the lawn corner. Thin silver arc catching evening light. Completely normal. I stayed inside and kept making dinner because honestly there was nothing to watch. Watering grass is not entertainment. About 10 seconds later I heard something unusual outside. Not yelling. Not drama. Just confused movement. Car door. Pause. Then another car door. I looked through the kitchen window. Linda had returned to the SUV carrying another shopping bag and was standing beside the front while looking surprised. Water from the sprinkler zone had reached the corner of the lawn and was doing exactly what irrigation systems do. Gentle rotating coverage. Full radius. Her front tire happened to be sitting directly where the coverage overlapped. The spray reached the lower side of the vehicle and part of the area beside it. Nothing intense. Just enough to make standing there inconvenient. She stepped back immediately and looked around trying to figure out where it came from. Then she saw me through the window. I waved. She waved back awkwardly. Then she looked at the sprinkler. Then the lawn. Then the tire. There was this exact moment where I watched her brain connect something I had been trying to explain for 2 weeks. That corner was not decorative. It was active space. She walked to the front door and knocked. I opened. She looked slightly annoyed but mostly confused. She asked if the sprinklers always ran at this time. I said sometimes depending on seasonal scheduling. She looked at the lawn and asked if I could pause them for a minute while she unloaded. I smiled and said I could, but the moisture cycle had already started and interrupting zones creates uneven coverage. Entirely true. She looked at me for a second and then asked, "So I cannot park there during watering?" I said that part of the lawn gets used. She looked toward the tire marks without realizing she did it. Then she laughed once and said, "Okay, fair enough." She moved the SUV into her driveway and finished unloading. End of story. That is what I expected. Saturday morning arrived. No tire marks. Interesting. Sunday too. Then Monday afternoon, I heard tires again. Same vehicle. Same arrival time. I looked outside expecting the usual angle. Instead, she parked fully in her driveway. No overlap. No curb contact. I almost laughed because after multiple conversations and explanations, apparently one scheduled irrigation cycle communicated better than words. Tuesday evening, she caught me outside adjusting flower beds and walked over. She smiled and said she did not realize the lawn corner actually had infrastructure underneath. Infrastructure. I like that word. I said most landscapes do. She nodded and said she honestly thought it was an used edge. Then she laughed and added she had never thought about grass needing appointments. That sentence made me laugh harder than expected. We stood there for a minute and she asked if the sprinkler always activates automatically. I said yes. She looked at the controller box near the garage and shook her head. She said that explains a lot. That afternoon she left, and for the first time in weeks the grass stayed untouched. 3 days passed. No tracks. Soil started recovering. Sprinkler head stayed aligned. I figured the lesson landed, and that would be the end. Then Friday evening I came home and found something sitting at the lawn corner. Small plastic yard marker pushed into the ground. Handwritten in black marker. Active zone. Parking unrecommended. I stared at it for a second and started laughing because I had not put it there. Across the street, Linda was watering flowers and pretending not to watch my reaction. I looked over. She shrugged and said apparently the edge gets used. The marker stayed there for 4 days and somehow became the funniest part of the entire situation. Small white plastic sign. Black handwritten letters. Active zone. Parking unrecommended. Every time I looked at it, I had to remind myself I did not make it. Linda never mentioned it again either. She just left it there like the lawn had become protected habitat. The grass started recovering faster than expected once tire pressure disappeared. Irrigation reached evenly. Soil loosened. The compressed corners slowly returned to matching color. It is strange how quickly things heal once people stop standing where they do not belong. A week later, I was trimming edges when Linda walked across the street carrying iced coffee and stopped near the marker. She looked at it and laughed. Then she asked if she could ask something without me thinking she was ridiculous. I said sure. She pointed at the irrigation controller and asked if the sprinklers actually change schedule automatically. I explained moisture adjustment, seasonal timing, cycle balancing, and how different zones activate depending on weather. She listened seriously for someone who previously believed grass was decorative carpet. Then she asked the question I had been waiting for. Did you move the schedule because of me? I looked at her for a second and said no. I optimized the schedule because temperatures changed. She stared for a second and said that somehow made it worse. I laughed and asked why. She said because now she felt like she lost an argument nobody was having. That line stayed with me. We stood there quietly for a minute and she admitted something unexpected. She said she grew up in apartments and never thought about yards as something active. To her, grass was scenery, not systems, not work, just green. That explained more than I expected. Sometimes people are not disrespectful. They are unfamiliar. Not always, but sometimes. She looked at the lawn and said she honestly thought she was borrowing and used space. I nodded and told her most people think that about boundaries. Then she surprised me again. She asked if she could help repair the corner. I laughed because it already looked fine, but she insisted. Saturday morning, she showed up wearing gardening gloves that looked brand new in the way gloves always do when purchased by optimistic people. We loosened compacted soil, added top dressing, reseeded a small section. Nothing dramatic. While working, she kept making jokes about checking for active irrigation alerts before entering zones. At one point, she stepped carefully around the sprinkler head and announced she respected local infrastructure. I nearly dropped the rake laughing. Around noon, a few neighbors walked by and asked what happened. Linda answered before I could. She pointed at the lawn and said I misunderstood where public parking ends and sprinkler jurisdiction begins. Nobody knew what that meant, but everybody nodded like it was profound. That afternoon, she came back, carrying something wrapped in paper. Inside was a small cast iron lawn border marker shaped like a sprinkler head. Simple, Decorative. The front had engraved text. Edge in use. I looked at it and laughed harder than I should have. We installed it beside the lawn corner where the tire marks used to appear. Not aggressive. Not warning people. Just enough to make somebody pause and notice the space exists. The next few weeks became strangely normal. No tracks. No awkwardness. Sometimes she parked carefully and exaggerated, staying 6 inches away from the curb just to make me laugh. One evening, while the sprinkler cycle started, she stood on the sidewalk and watched the rotation for a second. Then she said something that ended up mattering more than the whole situation. She said it is weird how once you know something belongs to somebody, you stop seeing it as empty. I looked at the lawn. Even green. Clean edges. Water moving in quiet arcs exactly on schedule. My father used to say systems work best when nobody notices them. But maybe boundaries work best when people finally do. What surprised me most was not that the tire marks stopped. It was how quickly the entire street started acting like the lawn had always mattered. About 2 weeks after the sprinkler moment, everything looked normal again. Grass recovered. The corner filled in. Irrigation stayed balanced. The little cast iron marker stayed near the edge, quietly doing absolutely nothing except making people smile. Every now and then somebody walking by would read edge in use and laugh. Linda claimed she regretted buying it because now she had accidentally created neighborhood lore. One Tuesday evening, I was adjusting sprinkler heads when she walked over carrying a folded brochure. She held it up and said she needed professional consultation. I opened it and realized it was a landscaping catalog. She pointed to a section showing decorative stone borders and asked which option would stop people from accidentally driving onto her yard corner. I looked at her for a second. She realized what she said and immediately started laughing. Then I started laughing. Then neither of us could stop because apparently this had become full-circle suburban character development. We walked across to her house and looked at the front yard. She pointed at a section near the curb and explained delivery vans occasionally clipped the edge when turning around. I asked what she wanted. She thought for a second and said something visible enough to remind people the space exists. That sentence felt familiar. I suggested low border stones and a subtle planting strip. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to make the edge feel intentional. My father used to say people respect finished things more than open invitations. Saturday morning we installed the border. Me leveling. Her pretending to understand measurements. At one point she picked up the measuring tape and announced she finally understood why I cared about 18 inches of lawn. Progress. Neighbors started stopping to talk. Frank appeared because apparently no outdoor activity can occur without unofficial commentary. He looked at the border and said the neighborhood was entering its defensive landscaping era. Nobody knew what that meant, but everyone agreed. Around noon somebody asked why Linda suddenly cared about curb boundaries. She pointed at me and said infrastructure education. That became a running joke for the rest of the afternoon. Later that evening, I was checking the sprinkler controller when my phone buzzed. Neighborhood group message. Someone posted a photo of Linda's new border with the caption, "Respect the edge." Comments started appearing. Somebody wrote that they never realized how often cars drift onto corners. Another person said they checked their own irrigation after reading the discussion. Then somebody asked whether anyone else had weird invisible spaces around their property people treat like public land. Suddenly, everyone had stories. Trash cans, side yards, shared drive confusion. It was oddly funny. Nobody argued. People just started noticing things. A week later, I came home and found a small envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a gift card to a garden center and a handwritten note. Thanks for not making this weird. Underneath, she added one more line. Also, your sprinklers have excellent timing. I put the note in the garage next to old manuals and spare nozzles because honestly it earned a place there. That evening, the front irrigation cycle started exactly at 6:08. Soft click. Rotation. Water moving across healthy grass. Linda happened to pull in at the same time. She parked carefully in her driveway, looked at the sprinkler for a second, then exaggerated a respectful bow toward the lawn corner before going inside. I stood there laughing and realized something my father probably understood years ago. Most people do not ignore boundaries because they are cruel. Sometimes they ignore them because nothing reminds them the boundary exists. Water did not teach a lesson. It just showed where the line had always been. The funny thing about solving one small problem is that people suddenly start trusting you with problems you never applied for. A month after the lawn stopped being temporary parking, I came home on a Thursday evening and found 3 people standing near my mailbox having what looked like a surprisingly serious conversation about decorative rocks. Frank saw me and immediately pointed like I had arrived to lead a summit. Apparently, one neighbor wanted to add a planting strip, another wanted to move a mailbox post, and somehow, because I owned a sprinkler controller, I had become local infrastructure support. I stood there listening while everybody explained their projects with unnecessary detail. Halfway through the conversation, Linda looked at me and said, "See, this is your fault. You made everybody think edges matter." She was joking, but she was not completely wrong. Once people notice boundaries, they start noticing design. That weekend, something unexpected happened. Several houses started making tiny changes. Nothing dramatic. One added low border plants. Another cleaned up a side path. Somebody painted curb markers. Nobody copied anyone. The neighborhood just looked slightly more intentional. It felt less like rules and more like people paying attention. Saturday morning, I was trimming grass when Linda walked over holding 2 coffee cups and a folded sheet of paper. She handed me 1 cup and unfolded the paper. It was a rough sketch of her front yard, border stones, flower spacing, driveway clearance. At the bottom, she had written 1 note. "Edge should look occupied." I looked at her and started laughing. She pointed at the sketch and said, "Do not judge me. I respect infrastructure now." We spent the morning measuring. She asked actual questions this time. How much space plants need? How drainage works? Why curves feel wider than straight lines? My father used to say people become careful the second they build something themselves. Around noon, we finished laying out the border and stepped back to look. It was simple, clean, nothing dramatic. But suddenly the front of her house looked finished. She stared at it for a second and said something interesting. "I always thought ownership meant maintenance. I did not realize it also means intention." That sentence stayed with me. Later that afternoon, a delivery van turned into the street and cut slightly wide near her corner. The driver slowed immediately when he saw the new border and corrected. Linda looked at me and smiled like she had discovered a secret. Nobody touched the edge. Not because there was a wall. Not because of rules. Just because now it looked like somebody cared. That evening, we sat in lawn chairs while the irrigation cycle started. Soft click. Water turning in even arcs across healthy grass. Linda looked at the sprinkler and asked if I ever planned to change the schedule back to mornings. I shrugged and said maybe eventually. She nodded and then smiled. "Leave it. It keeps people honest." I laughed because she said it like the sprinkler had become neighborhood philosophy. A few days later, I noticed something I had not seen in weeks. No tire marks anywhere. Not just my lawn. Nobody drifted onto corners anymore. Cars parked straighter. Turned cleaner. Tiny change, but visible. One evening while bringing trash bins in, I stopped beside the cast iron marker and looked at the words. "Edge in use." Such a ridiculous little object to become symbolic. My father used to say good systems disappear into normal life. Looking around the street, that is exactly what happened. Nobody thought about boundaries anymore because they no longer had to. They could see them. And once people can see something, they usually stop borrowing it. By the time summer started ending, nobody remembered the original tire marks anymore. They remembered the jokes. That is usually how neighborhoods heal. Not through meetings. Through stories people repeat until the frustrating part becomes funny. One Friday evening, I came home carrying groceries and stopped halfway up the driveway because something looked different. Not wrong, just organized. 3 houses on the street had added small details. One had decorative edging. One had low lighting near the curb. Another added planters near the sidewalk. Nothing matched. Nobody copied anybody. But suddenly, every edge looked intentional. I stood there for a second and realized the whole street felt calmer. My father used to say, "Unfinished spaces invite assumptions. Finished spaces invite respect." I put groceries inside and walked back out. Linda was across the street adjusting flowers along her new border. She looked up and said, "Welcome to the accidental movement." I laughed and asked if she was taking credit. She pointed at my lawn and said, "No, your sprinkler has leadership qualities." That evening, a few neighbors gathered near the sidewalk because apparently standing outside and pretending not to socialize is mandatory suburban culture. Somebody mentioned how different the street looked. Frank immediately declared that we had entered the era of visible boundaries. Nobody asked what that meant because by now we had accepted he talks like community newsletters. Then something funny happened. A delivery driver turned into the street and slowed automatically near the curb corners. Nobody said anything. Nobody pointed. He just drove carefully. Linda noticed too. She looked at me and quietly said that never used to happen. We stood there watching for a second. She asked if I thought people actually changed or if they were just reacting to visual cues. I thought about it and said probably both. She nodded and said she still feels ridiculous thinking she once believed lawn corners did not count. Then she smiled and added that she notices edges everywhere now. Parking lots, walkways, gardens. She said once you realize somebody designed a space, it becomes harder to treat it like empty background. Saturday morning she knocked on my door, holding a small box. Inside was a custom metal plate. Same style as the little cast iron marker. But this one had engraved coordinates and a line underneath. Local boundary. Frequently misunderstood. I laughed immediately and asked if she was opening a museum. She said no, she just thought the original marker deserved an upgrade. We installed it near the lawn edge where the sprinkler coverage started. Small, quiet, easy to miss unless you stood there. That afternoon, I ran the irrigation cycle manually because I reseeded a small section nearby. Water rose in clean arcs across healthy grass. A few neighbors walking by stopped and joked about respecting active zones. Someone saluted the sprinkler. At some point, the entire thing became absurd in the best possible way. Sunday evening, I sat outside watching the last cycle finish. Soft clicking, water fading, lawn darkening evenly in the evening light. Linda walked by carrying groceries and stopped deliberately at the curb. She looked at the grass and announced, "I am staying outside the jurisdiction line." Then she laughed and kept walking. I sat there smiling because the weird part was realizing none of this had ever been about catching somebody. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was designed to embarrass anyone. The schedule already existed. The lawn already existed. The only thing that changed was somebody finally noticed the edge had always been real. My father used to say good systems do not punish mistakes. They reveal them gently enough that people choose differently next time. Looking at the street, the borders, the healthier grass, and the ridiculous little sign beside the curb, I realized that was exactly what happened. The last thing I expected from a tire mark was that it would become a neighborhood reference point. Months passed. Weather changed. Grass thickened. The little corner near the curb became impossible to identify as the place where all of this started. Healthy color, clean edge, sprinkler head perfectly level. If you moved into the neighborhood later, you would never know anything happened there at all except for one detail. The small metal marker stayed. Local boundary. Frequently misunderstood. Every time I looked at it, I laughed because it sounded way more serious than the story deserved. My father would have approved. He believed the best reminders should be useful first and funny second. Autumn arrived quietly. Cooler evenings. Longer shadows. Irrigation schedules adjusted automatically again. One evening, I was sitting outside with coffee listening to the controller click through zones when Linda walked across carrying a small paper bag. She sat in the chair beside mine and handed it over. Inside was a sprinkler timer. Cheap. Basic. Probably $15. I looked at her and asked what this was. She smiled and said symbolic accountability. Then she explained she bought it after redesigning her flower beds because apparently she now trusted schedules more than guessing. I laughed and asked if this was her origin story. She pointed at my lawn and said, "No, this is evidence." We sat quietly for a while watching water move across the grass in soft arcs. Then she asked a question I had not thought about before. She asked if I ever got angry about the whole thing. I thought about it honestly. I told her I was annoyed at first. But after a while I realized I did not want an apology. I wanted the edge to stop disappearing. She nodded slowly and looked out at the street. Then she said she thought people assume respect means agreement when most of the time it just means noticing where somebody else ends. That sentence stayed with me. A few weeks later, the neighborhood held one of those seasonal porch decorating contests that nobody admits to caring about and everybody secretly tracks. I did not participate because my competitive relationship with decorative pumpkins ended years ago. But on judging day, I opened my front door and found a ribbon tied around the cast iron marker. Small card attached. Best use of existing infrastructure. No explanation. No prize. Just neighborhood humor. I laughed harder than I should have. Frank later admitted he invented the category because he believed the sprinkler deserved recognition. Fair enough. That evening I untied the ribbon and placed it in the garage beside old irrigation manuals. My father kept strange things too. Receipts, labels, notes, proof that ordinary days happened. Winter came and watering season ended. One morning before shutting the system down, I ran the front zone one last time. Water rose in slow, clean arcs across healthy grass. Same corner, same schedule, same routine. I stood there with coffee and realized something. The sprinkler never protected the lawn. The schedule did not teach anybody a lesson. All it did was make something visible that had always existed. The edge mattered because somebody cared about it. That was enough. As I turned the controller to winter mode, I noticed fresh footprints in the grass leading toward the curb. No tire marks, just footsteps. At the edge of the lawn sat a tiny wooden sign someone placed overnight, handwritten in black paint. Respect grows where attention goes. No signature. I smiled, left it exactly where it was, and went inside because sometimes the funniest kind of justice is not winning an argument. Sometimes it is realizing nobody argues anymore. And every now and then, when irrigation season starts again and I hear that quiet click from the controller at exactly the right time, I still look out the window automatically. Not because I expect tire marks, just because I like knowing the edge is still in use.